Is there anything else you guys want to touch on there?
Well, I just want to say, and we make this point in the book, I think we even have a section called The Case for Hybrids, right?
Mhm.
Hybrids are getting, and I talked about this earlier with relation to the plug-in hybrid vehicle. So you have the plug-in hybrid vehicle, which is getting a lot of bad press because of consumer behavior. Then you have the full hybrid vehicle, which is getting bad press because of maybe some of the marketing strategy around it and some other issues, right? You don't ever plug that one in, so people don't really see that as an electrified vehicle in the same way. But really, what we say in the book and what we believe is that hybrids, and Felix alluded to this earlier, put a small battery in every car, at least, right?
Mhm.
That's job number one. Put a small battery in every car. We know there are big advantages you can get there. So we want, one of my reasons for writing this book, and I believe Felix as well, is let's not forget about the hybrid. We should really be taking a lot more advantage of the hybrid. Both plugins and full hybrids have their uses. And so I would say from the mix of technology standpoint, that's a technology that in itself is a mix of technologies, right? It takes kind of the best components of the ICE and the best components of the BEV and puts them together, and really addresses a lot of the problems that you see. So I would say for mix of technologies, that's just one more point that I wanted to make.
Maybe e-fuels is too. So this was very high level touched on earlier, but Felix, would you want to talk a bit more about e-fuels and the importance there and what we're talking about?
Yeah, so we have quite a long discussion on e-fuels, or sometimes known as electrofuels or power to liquid or something like that. And these can really be almost anything in terms of like their chemical composition. It could even be hydrogen. That's a type of e-fuel. And it's a way of having net zero or perhaps even net negative, depending on exactly what you do with them, fueling. And the idea is similar to biofuels, except perhaps biofuels you take the energy from the sun and use that to sort of convert CO2 into a fuel. With an e-fuel, you take energy from ideally a renewable power source, maybe solar, something like that, and convert that into a fuel. And you say you take CO2 from the atmosphere or some other source like maybe a power station or something, and convert that into a fuel. And of course, that's a way of using some of the existing fleets to decarbonize. But of course, it's going to be pretty energy intensive to do that, probably very expensive. And there are probably sectors other than light duty where we'd want to do that first, like aviation. So sustainable aviation fuels are a really hot topic right now. Maybe even marine. So there's a lot of interest in methanol or ammonia, both of which are kind of e-fuels or types of e-fuel from the marine sector. So I think my view, and I won't speak for Kelly here, is that there may be some applications in light duty for e-fuels, but probably there'll be bigger calls on them, at least to begin with. But on the other hand, biofuels have maybe a natural limit, but they are already in the light duty sector, whether or not people are aware. Certainly here in the UK, E5 or E10 are getting pretty common, and I think it's the same in the US. So that is already a biofuel. And so, okay, there's a lot of discussion that could be had, and now's probably not the time, about land use change, how sustainable are some biofuels, and so on. But they're already there. I guess it's just another sort of pathway along this journey that we can take.
Yeah. So then the second point I think has been a kind of an overarching theme of a lot of we talked about here. So decarbonizing as quickly as possible. So yeah, we're not waiting ideally for 20 years down the road when everyone switches over and we have 100% clean BEV utilization. Is there anything else that we didn't cover or anything that you want to highlight on that point?
I would just say that I really believe passionately in it. The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is not solely dependent on when we decarbonize, but it's also how quickly we decarbonize, right? So, people talk about 2040, 2050 as kind of net zero years, but how you get to net zero is just as important or more important as when you achieve net zero. So I think, one of the reasons I was writing this book is to say we've got to do this quickly, and we're offering some thoughts and ideas as to how to do that.
And I'll just plug hybrids one more time
I was going to say,
that. Yeah. So hybrids really are in a lot of places of the world the fastest way to decarbonize. So, of course, that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep improving BEVs for themselves. I mean, we need to, right? But hybrids, we should be driving a lot of hybrids right now.
Yeah, and I think that ties nicely too into jumping to the fourth point. So consumer behavior. I mean, switching from a pure conventional vehicle to a full hybrid is a much easier, more natural switch in terms of cost, and then also everyday driving behavior than switching to a BEV or even a plug-in.
Yeah, and you know, we contrast the average mileage that in the UK and the US against what people perceive as a need. So you know, for most people, the average mileage that you might drive each day is less than 20 miles. Um, but people still like to know that they have the ability to drive 3, 4, 500 miles in one go. You know, if you know a relative gets sick or something, and you just need to jump in the car and go. And I think that's where consumer behavior is so important, because if I was just looking at this purely from an engineering perspective, I'd say, well, if people do an average 20 miles a day, then if we give everyone a BEV with a 50-mile range, problem solved. But the problem is no one would, and clearly no one does buy a BEV with a 50-mile range. So, you know, it's about understanding why people make the kind of engineering demands that they do and how we can achieve that in the best way possible. And plug-in hybrids are a great example, because everyone could do that average journey in almost all of the plug-in hybrids available today. But we know that actually in practice they don't charge them, and there's all these kind of, they're not really unintended consequences, but you know the how people use them and how an engineer thinks they should be used are really divergent. And we've talked about this a bit already. And so, you know, we strongly advocate, I think I say something like not forgetting about consumers and consumer choice and consumer preference, because people don't necessarily do what you think they're going to with the technology.
Yeah, and then the fourth of these points to talk about, so this global perspective. So Felix, you touched on earlier, and kind of this understanding that electricity isn't as readily available throughout the world as you might think living in a first world country. Also, from a life cycle analysis perspective, it seems like it's almost always you see North America, Europe, China as kind of disproportionately represented in these figures, whereas there's a lot of people living outside of those areas. Can you guys just talk a bit more about kind of what you mean, and how important it is to maintain this global perspective?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. There are a couple big points there. One is the life cycle analysis, right, and how electricity is made in different parts of the world. But the other is, you know, I think, do we do this in the book, Felix? I should know this, but I think we talk about this where we look at, there was a study done where it looked at, you know, the uptake of BEVs in Europe versus the GDP of different countries, right? And it sort of showed that there's a strong correlation between the rich countries, I'll say, or the more well-off countries, and the uptake of BEVs, right? BEVs are still, I mean, yeah, there are a lot of subsidies, there are a lot of incentives and things like that. But BEVs are still more expensive than a conventional internal combustion engine, and someone's got to pay at some point, right? So I would say both in terms of life cycle analysis and in terms of just the wealth of different countries, I think both of those are really important to keep in mind, as well as, you know, not everyone has access to electricity, like Felix mentioned earlier. Felix, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just would also add that one of the things that really struck me as we were kind of researching and writing this was that lots of people use transportation for different things. And we've already had conversations about public transportation and kind of not using cars. And that's more prevalent in Europe than it is in the US. And that's partly because of infrastructure. It's partly just because of geography. In the UK, everything is much closer together than it is in the USA. And again, this feeds into how people use the technology and what technology may be the most appropriate for them. And I think that one of the big advantages of what we're suggesting is that it allows for that. And it may be that certain countries adopt a certain technology on a country level, like we've already seen that Norway has got a huge sort of number of BEVs already on the roads, because Norway is perfectly suited to the BEV. The distances aren't that long because of the way the country is structured, and the amount of hydroelectric power that they've got means that their electricity carbon intensity is very, very, very low. But Norway is not necessarily representative of other countries, and so we also just need to bear in mind that, not just from all the aspects that Kelly was talking about, but also just countries are different, and so they may have different transportation needs.